Inflation. It's one of those words we hear almost every single day now. But unlike many abstract economic terms, inflation is something you can feel every time you shop for groceries, pay rent, or fill up your car. Over the past 2 years, inflation has gone from a background concept in textbooks to a very real challenge shaping how we live our lives. Why did this happen? Well, the truth is, there isn't just one reason. Low interest rates made borrowing cheap. Governments pumped out record levels of stimulus. Supply chains broke down after global lockdowns. And let's be honest, many companies realized they could raise prices under the excuse of inflation even when they themselves were driving it. That's the dangerous thing about inflation. Unlike losing your job or facing a stock market crash, there's almost no escaping it. It hits hardest at the people who can least afford it. We've been tracking inflation since the very beginning, when factories first shut down and stimulus checks rolled out. And in that time, the story has shifted wildly. First, we were told inflation isn't a problem, then it's just transitory. Now, central banks and governments all over the world are calling it their #1 priority. But here's the twist. Just because inflation is finally the focus doesn't mean it will magically disappear. There are forces governments can fight and forces completely outside their control. The everyday reality of inflation. Inflation. It's one of those words that sounds abstract, something distant that economists argue about on TV. But for ordinary people, inflation isn't an economic theory, it's a lived reality. It's not numbers on a spreadsheet, it's the receipt you hold in your hand, the rent you pay at the end of the month, the gas tank you fill just to get to work. Imagine you walk into a supermarket with your usual grocery list: bread, milk, eggs, rice, vegetables, ordinary items. But at the checkout, the bill is higher than last month, not just by a few cents, but by a few dollars. And if you compare it to a year ago, the jump is staggering. Yet your income hasn't increased. You're still working the same hours, maybe more, but your money buys less. That's the sting of inflation. It's not just numbers. It's a slow erosion of purchasing power, a silent tax, a thief that doesn't rob your wallet directly, but weakens the value of everything inside it. And while inflation affects everyone, it does so unevenly. The wealthy notice it, but they can adapt. They cut back on luxuries, delay investments, or shuffle their portfolios. For working-class families, inflation isn't an inconvenience, it's a crisis. It forces impossible choices. Do you buy enough food, or do you keep the lights on? Do you pay the rent, or do you cover your child's medicine? These aren't economic questions, they're survival questions. Inflation also has a psychological weight. It creates stress and anxiety that ripple through households. Parents worry about affording school supplies. Retirees panic as their fixed pensions lose value. Young adults wonder if they'll ever save enough to own a home when costs outpace wages year after year. What makes inflation especially cruel is its creeping nature. It doesn't hit all at once like a financial crash. It sneaks up. Month after month, small increases build until suddenly you realize you can't afford the same life you once could. Leaders once dismissed this. They called it transitory. They promised the problem would fade. But as prices stayed stubbornly high, their tone shifted. Inflation became enemy #1, not just in speeches, but in the lived struggles of millions. And here lies the question. What truly caused this surge? Why now? To understand, we must look at the perfect storm: stimulus policies, supply chain chaos, corporate profit strategies, and global shocks. That's where the story begins.
What really caused inflation? Inflation rarely has a single cause. It's more like a fire fueled by many sparks. And in this case, sparks were everywhere. First, cheap money. When the pandemic hit, central banks slashed interest rates to near zero. Borrowing became cheap. Mortgages, car loans, business loans, credit was easy to get, and everyone rushed to take advantage. Second, government stimulus. Trillions were injected into households and businesses. For many, this was a lifeline, preventing mass unemployment and economic collapse. But all that money came with a cost. Too many dollars chasing too few goods. Third, the supply chain breakdown. Factories shut down, ports clogged, container shortages left ships stranded at sea. Suddenly, the global supply machine that delivered everything from electronics to food slowed to a crawl. Fewer goods meant higher prices. And then came corporate behavior. Companies saw the chaos as cover. They raised prices more than necessary, citing inflation as justification. But behind the scenes, many of these companies posted record profits. Consumers paid the price, not just for rising costs, but for opportunism. This perfect storm created inflation unlike anything seen in decades. It wasn't just about one policy or one event. It was the collision of easy money, heavy spending, supply shortages, and corporate greed. The problem? Once inflation takes hold, it spreads. Rising prices in one sector bleed into others. Higher shipping costs raise the price of food. Higher rents push up wages, which push up costs further. The cycle feeds itself. Leaders hoped it would fade, but it didn't. And soon, central banks faced a choice: act aggressively or risk losing control.
Central banks, interest rates, and the housing trap. Central banks were supposed to prevent this. Their mission is stability, keeping inflation in check while supporting growth. But in many countries, they waited too long. Take Australia. In 2021, the Reserve Bank governor publicly promised not to raise interest rates until at least 2024. Homebuyers rushed into mortgages, convinced low rates were here to stay. Then reality hit. Inflation soared, and suddenly, 8 consecutive rate hikes slammed households. Mortgage payments doubled or tripled. Families who thought they'd bought security were thrown into financial chaos. The same story unfolded globally. The U.S. Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and others were slow to react. When they finally moved, they did so with urgency, raising rates aggressively to cool inflation. But raising rates is a blunt weapon. It doesn't target corporate profiteering or supply chain shocks. It simply makes borrowing more expensive, slowing demand across the board. The result? Homeowners and small businesses bore the brunt. A family in debt feels every percentage point. A small business owner sees loans dry up. Meanwhile, large corporations with deep reserves weather the storm far more easily. So the tragedy is this: the very people central banks were meant to protect are the ones suffering most. Inflation may eventually ease, but at the cost of households drowning under higher interest bills. This raises a bigger question. Even if demand cools, will prices actually fall, or are we stuck with a new, more expensive normal?
The sticky price problem. Here's the hard truth. Prices rise quickly, but they rarely fall. This is called price stickiness. Take groceries. When supply chain costs eased, many expected food prices to drop, but they didn't. Rent is the same. Once landlords raise it, it almost never goes back down. Utility bills, energy prices, subscription services all follow the same pattern. Once people adjust to paying more, businesses see little reason to reverse course. Some of this stickiness comes from contracts. Rent is fixed for months. Wages move slowly. Businesses negotiate supplier contracts yearly, not weekly. This means prices don't respond instantly, even if costs fall. But part of it is strategy. If consumers have already proven they'll pay higher prices, why lower them? Companies hold on to the extra margin. Even global events fuel stickiness. The war in Ukraine sent energy prices soaring. Even as markets stabilize, those higher price points remain. And when people accept them as the new normal,
Inflation becomes embedded. This is why central banks act so aggressively. They know that once inflation gets sticky, reversing it becomes almost impossible without inflicting real pain. And that's the stage we're in now.
The future of inflation. So where does this end? The good news, some of the original drivers, stimulus spending, supply shortages, shipping chaos, are fading. Ports are unclogging. Factories are back online. Trade flows are improving. But the bad news, sticky prices, corporate profits, and global instability remain. Energy markets are volatile. Food supply chains remain fragile. Political conflicts, from Ukraine to trade wars, threaten stability. The most likely outcome? Prices stop rising as fast, but they don't return to where they were. Inflation slows, but the higher costs become permanent. A new baseline is set. For families, this means adjusting budgets, learning to live with higher costs. For governments, it means regaining trust after years of missteps. And for central banks, it's a reminder of the danger of waiting too long. But there's hope, too. Employment remains strong in many regions. Innovation in technology, energy, and logistics offers long-term relief. And history tells us inflation cycles eventually end. The question is how much damage will be done before stability returns. In the end, inflation is more than an economic measure. It's a story of lives reshaped, of choices forced, of trust tested. And as we move forward, it reminds us of a simple truth. Stability is fragile, and once lost, it is painfully hard to rebuild.